The air at the Miller Farm auction hung thick and heavy, a soupy mix of late August humidity, diesel fumes, and the sweet, cloying smell of desperation. It was 1974, a time when a man's worth was measured in horsepower and the shine on his new iron. I leaned against the fender of my old Ford F-250, the one with the primer grey door from a junkyard donor, and watched the vultures circle. Not the feathered kind, but the kind in seed corn hats and grease-stained overalls, their eyes gleaming as another man's life was sold off, piece by painful piece. Old Man Miller had made the same mistake a lot of fellas were making. He'd listened to the whispers of easy money, of ever-rising land values and corn prices that were supposed to kiss the sky and never come down. He'd traded in his paid-for equipment, signed his name on a stack of papers at the Production Credit Association, and brought home a brand-new John Deere 44430, with a sound guard cab so quiet you could hear a mouse cough. He'd even bought a new 6-row planter to go with it. 12 months later, a bad heart and 2 bad harvests put him in the ground and his whole operation on the auction block. The auctioneer, a fast-talking fellow named Gus, was working the crowd like a preacher at a revival. His voice, a gravelly sing-song amplified by a tinny loudspeaker, bounced off the side of the barn. "All right, gentlemen, next up we got a real gem, a 1972 International Harvester, Vostor 6 Turbo. Look at the rubber on that thing, boys, barely scuffed. Who'll start the bidding at 10,000? Do I hear 10? My eyes drifted over to Chet Ainsworth. He was standing near the front, chest puffed out, a fresh pioneer seed hat perched on his head. Chet was the poster boy for the new way of farming. He'd inherited a decent spread from his daddy, but instead of building on it slowly, he'd leveraged every square inch of it. His fields were a showroom of the latest and greatest. Brand new Steiger 4-wheel drives, Gleaner combines with air-conditioned cabs, and rows of shiny red implements that hadn't seen a speck of rust. He was farming more acres than any 3 men in the county combined, all of it on the bank's dime. Chet raised a finger, almost lazily. 10,000, he called out, his voice full of the easy confidence that only comes from spending other people's money. A few murmurs went through the crowd. 10 grand was steep, but for a nearly new 1466, it was in the ballpark. The bidding went up in $500 increments, but it was clear from the start where that tractor was going. Chet didn't even flinch. He just nodded at Gus each time, a little smirk playing on his lips. When the bidding stalled at 12.5, Gus pointed his gavel right at him. "Sold to Mr. Chet Ainsworth for $12,500. A fine piece of iron, sir. A fine piece indeed." Chet just gave a magnanimous wave of his hand, like a king acknowledging his subjects. His gaze swept over the crowd, and, for a moment, it landed on me. He took in my worn-out work boots, my faded denim shirt, and the old John Deere cap on my head. Then his eyes flicked over to my truck and the old, tired-looking piece of equipment I'd come to bid on, a John Deere 45 combine, a relic from the late 50s with an open operator's station and a rusty grain head. Chet's smirk widened into a full-blown grin. He nudged the man next to him, another one of the big operators, and gestured with his chin in my direction. I couldn't hear what he said, but I didn't have to. The look on their faces said it all. They were laughing at me, Earl Miller, no relation to the poor soul whose farm was being dismantled, and my penchant for old, paid-for junk. I wasn't a big-timer like Chet. I farmed the 160 acres my grandfather had homesteaded, plus another 80 I rented from a widow down the road. My main tractor was a 1968 John Deere 4020, a diesel side console model that I knew inside and out. I'd bought it used 5 years ago for cash, saved up from selling off a few head of cattle and working winters at the co-op. It wasn't fancy. The paint was faded to a pale green, the seat was cracked, and the fenders were dented from a run-in with a gatepost. But that tractor was mine. Every nut, every bolt, every drop of oil in it belonged to me, not the bank. When I turned the key, that 6-cylinder diesel engine roared to life with a sound that was pure, unadulterated freedom. It was the sound of no payments, no interest, no banker breathing down my neck. The rest of my fleet was a similar story. An old Farmel M for light work, a John Deere B for cultivating, and my pride and joy for planting, a 4-row John Deere 71 flexi planter that I'd rebuilt from the ground up. The men like Chet, they called my operation a museum. They'd drive by my place in their new air-conditioned pickups and shake their heads, wondering how I even managed to get a crop in the ground. They didn't understand. They saw rust and faded paint. I saw reliability. They saw old technology. I saw simplicity. When Chet's brand new planter broke down because of a faulty hydraulic solenoid, he had to wait 3 days for a dealer mechanic to come out with a computer to diagnose it. When my planter broke a chain, I could fix it in 20 minutes with a spare link and a pair of pliers. Gus finally moved on to the smaller items: tools, wagons, and finally, the old combine. All right, boys, here she is. A John Deere Model 45. She ain't pretty, but she'll get the job done. Who'll give me $500 for it? $500 to put yourself in the harvesting business. Silence. A few guys chuckled. A 45 was ancient history. Most everyone had moved on to the 105s or the new 6600s. 400, Gus pleaded. Come on, the scrap man will give you that for the weight. I raised my hand. 400. Gus's face lit up. I got 400. Do I hear 450? 450? Chet let out a loud, theatrical laugh. Hell, Earl, you gonna power that thing with a team of mules? The crowd roared. My face burned hot, but I kept my eyes fixed on Gus. I knew what they didn't. I'd looked that combine over before the auction started. The engine, a little 6-cylinder gas motor, was clean. The belts were cracked but serviceable for a season, and the cylinder bars, while worn, had enough life left for my 240 acres. It needed work, a lot of it, but its bones were good. More importantly, it was simple. No complex hydraulics, no fancy electronics, just a series of belts, chains, and gears that a man with a wrench and some patience could understand. 400 going once, going twice. Gus scanned the crowd, but no one else was even looking. Sold to Earl Miller for $400. I walked up to the auctioneer's table, pulled a worn leather wallet from my back pocket, and counted out 20 $20 bills. The clerk, a young woman who looked bored out of her mind, handed me the receipt. As I turned to leave, Chet was standing there, blocking my path. $400, huh, Earl? He said, that condescending grin plastered on his face. You really know how to pinch a penny. What's the matter? The bank cut you off? I don't have a line at the bank, Chet, I said, my voice low and even. I don't borrow what I can't pay for in cash. He scoffed. You can't expand that way. You can't grow. This is 1974, not 1934. You gotta use leverage, take a risk. The government's backing the loans. Land's going up 10% a year, and corn's over $3 a bushel. A man would be a fool not to borrow every cent he can get his hands on and buy up more ground. Maybe, I said, stepping around him. Or a man would be a fool to bet his whole life on the idea that the good times will last forever. He just shook his head as I walked away, a look of pity on his face. He and his friends went back to their circle, laughing and talking about the new tractors they were going to buy, the new farms they were going to rent. They were living in a different world, a world of easy credit and endless optimism. I was living in the real world, the one where you paid your own way, fixed your own equipment, and slept soundly at night because the only person you owed anything to was yourself. Before we go any further into this story, I have to ask you something. As you listen to this, think about your own life, your own work. Have you ever been in my shoes? Have you ever chosen the old, reliable, paid-for path when everyone around you was chasing the new, shiny, and debt-fueled dream? Drop a comment below and tell me about it. I want to know if there are still folks out there who understand the value of $1 earned over $1 borrowed. Getting that old John Deere 45 home was a chore in itself. I had to winch it onto my neighbor's tandem axle trailer, a slow, creaking process that drew more than a few stares from the departing auction crowd. Once back at my farmstead, the real work began. For the next 2 months, every spare hour I had was spent in the machine shed, bathed in the yellow glow of a single bare bulb hanging from a cord. The first order of business was the engine. It was a Hercules JX4D, a tough but thirsty little gas engine. I drained the old sludgy oil, which came out looking like molasses. I pulled the plugs. They were fouled black with carbon. I spent a whole Saturday taking the carburetor apart on my workbench, soaking each tiny jet and needle valve in a can of Berryman's carb dip until the brass gleamed like new. I replaced the points, condenser, rotor, and cap. I put in new plugs, gapped to exactly 25 thousandths of an inch, and filled the crankcase with fresh 30-weight oil. When I finally hooked a battery up to it and hit the starter, it coughed, sputtered black smoke. And then, with a final turn of the key, it roared to life. It wasn't a smooth, quiet purr like the new diesels, but a loud, throaty, uneven rumble. To me, it was the sound of progress. Next came the guts of the machine. I crawled inside the threshing cylinder, a cramped, dusty space that smelled of mouse nests and rust. With a flashlight clenched in my teeth, I inspected every one of the cylinder bars. 3 of them were bent. I spent the better part of a day heating them with an acetylene torch and hammering them back into shape, checking the clearance with a feeler gauge until it was perfect. I replaced a dozen worn-out belts, splicing the big canvas draper belts for the grain platform by hand, a tedious job of punching holes and riveting that left my fingers raw. I greased every Zerk fitting I could find, dozens of them, forcing fresh grease in until the old, hardened gunk squeezed out. My neighbors thought I was crazy. They'd drive by and see me, covered head to toe in grease and grime, wrestling with that ancient piece of machinery. Chet Ainsworth made a point of driving his new 1466 past my place one afternoon, pulling a brand new 24-foot disc. The roar of his turbocharged diesel engine was a stark contrast to the clanking and banging coming from my shed. He slowed down, gave me that same pitying look, and then gunned the engine, leaving a cloud of black smoke in his wake. It was his way of saying, "Look what you could have if you weren't so stubborn and old-fashioned." That fall during harvest, the difference between our 2 worlds became even more apparent. Chet rolled through his cornfields with a brand-new Gleaner L combine, its 8-row corn head gobbling up acres at a dizzying pace. He had a fleet of grain trucks running to the elevator, and he was done with his corn in less than a week. My harvest was a slower, more deliberate affair. The old JD45 only had a 2-row corn head. My progress was measured in feet per minute, not miles per hour. I sat out in the open, exposed to the wind and the dust, the noise of the engine and the threshing mechanism, a constant roar in my ears. I'd fill the combine's small grain tank, then drive over to my old grain truck, a 1958 Chevy Viking with a leaky hydraulic hoist, and auger the corn off. It was slow, tedious, and dirty work. One afternoon, I broke down. A bearing on the main separator shaft seized up, screaming like a banshee before locking solid and snapping a drive belt. I was halfway through my last field. I shut everything down and just sat there for a minute, the sudden silence deafening. A wave of frustration and exhaustion washed over me. I could see Chet's fancy operation on the horizon, a whirlwind of efficiency and power. And here I was, dead in the water, with 100 acres of corn still standing. For a moment, I let myself think about how easy it would be. Just walk into the bank, sign a piece of paper, and have a new machine delivered the next day. No grease, no busted knuckles, no nights spent worrying if a 20-year-old part would last one more season. But then I looked at my hands, calloused and stained with grease. I looked at the field, the neat rows of corn I had planted and cultivated myself, and I looked at the machine shed in the distance, a building my father and I had built with our own hands. This was all mine. The struggle, the sweat, the breakdowns, they were part of the price of ownership, the cost of true independence. I got off the combine, walked back to the shed, and grabbed my tools. It took me the rest of the day and half the night, working by the light of a lantern, but I got that bearing replaced. I had a spare one on a shelf, salvaged from an old baler. The next morning, as the sun came up, I fired up the old 45 and finished my harvest. I was the last farmer in the county to get my crops out, but I got them out. And when I sold my grain, every single dollar of that check went into my pocket, not the bank's. The mid-1970s were a heady time to be a farmer. The Russian grain deal had sent commodity prices soaring. Corn was fetching prices we'd only dreamed of a few years earlier. Land values were climbing so fast it made your head spin. The government, under Secretary of Agriculture Earl Butts, was telling us to plant fence-a-row to fence-a-row. The banks were practically begging farmers to take out loans. Interest rates were high, but with the price of corn and soybeans, nobody seemed to care. The mantra was, get bigger or get out. Chet Ainsworth took that mantra to heart. He was a golden boy, a shining example of the new agricultural prosperity. With the profits from the 74 and 75 harvests, he didn't just pay down his loans, he doubled down. He bought the 200-acre farm that bordered his to the west, paying a record price per acre that made all the old-timers in the coffee shop shake their heads. To work that new ground, he traded in his already newish equipment for the biggest and best iron money could buy. The IH 1466 was replaced by a brand new International Harvester 1586, a beast of a tractor, with a Deluxe cab and more horsepower than he could ever possibly use. He bought a new Gleaner M2 combine and a 12-row planter. His farmstead began to look less like a working farm and more like a dealer's lot. He put up massive new grain bins with automatic dryers, a heated workshop big enough to park his combine in, and a new ranch-style house for his family, complete with a 2-car garage and central air conditioning. He was living the dream. Every time I saw him at the co-op, he was holding court, bragging about his yields, his new equipment, his ever-expanding empire. "You see, Earl," he told me one day, leaning against the counter as I was paying for a bag of seed corn, "you got to spend money to make money. Look at you, still running that old 40-20. You could trade that thing in and get a 44-40. Finance the rest. You double your productivity overnight. You're leaving money on the table." "I'm sleeping at night, Chet," I replied, pocketing my change. "That's worth more to me than a few extra bushels." He just laughed and shook his head. "You'll never learn," he said, clapping me on the shoulder as he walked away. The community saw him as a visionary, a man with ambition. They saw me as a relic, a stubborn old fool who was afraid of progress. The banker would greet Chet with a wide smile and a firm handshake. He'd give me a polite but dismissive nod. At church potlucks, the other farmers would gather around Chet, listening intently as he talked about commodity futures and tax depreciation strategies. I'd usually end up in the corner with the old men, talking about the weather and the price of repairs. I was seen as a failure, a man who lacked the guts to take a risk, to reach for the brass ring. My discipline was interpreted as timidity. My self-reliance was seen as backwardness. Meanwhile, I stuck to my plan. The good prices were a blessing, and I used them not to expand, but to solidify. I put a new steel roof on the barn. I replaced the worn-out tires on the 4020. I bought a used but solid gravity wagon to make unloading the combine easier. Every purchase was made with cash. I paid off the last few dollars I owed on my 80 rented acres, buying it outright from the widow, who was happy to sell to someone she knew would care for the land. That brought my total holdings to 240 acres, all of it free and clear. It wasn't an empire like Chet's, but it was a kingdom, and I was the undisputed king. I kept my costs low. I did all my own repairs, learned to weld, and became a master at scavenging parts from scrapyards. While Chet was paying the dealership hundreds of dollars for a service call, I was rebuilding a water pump on my workbench for the cost of a gasket kit. While he was burning through fuel in his massive tractors, I was getting the job done with my efficient, smaller equipment. My profit margins were much higher than his, but nobody saw that. All they saw was his gross income, his massive scale. They were mesmerized by the top line, blind to the crushing weight of the bottom line, the one that listed his debts. By 1978, the cracks were starting to show, but you had to be looking closely to see them. Inflation, which had been simmering for years, started to boil over. The price of everything began to skyrocket. Fuel, fertilizer, seed, parts. A gallon of diesel that cost 30 cents in 1973 was now pushing $1. The Federal Reserve, trying to tame inflation, started jacking up interest rates. The prime rate, the one the banks based their loans on, began a relentless climb. I felt the pinch like everyone else. My input costs went up, and it hurt. But my biggest expense, debt service, was zero. I had no interest payments to make. Chet, on the other hand, was leveraged to the hilt. His loans weren't fixed rate, they were variable. Every time the Fed raised the rates, his payments went up. He was running harder and harder, just to stay in the same place. The talk in the coffee shop started to change. The easy optimism was replaced by a nervous tension. Guys who had been bragging about the new tractors they were going to buy were now complaining about the price of fuel. The price of corn and soybeans, while still decent, had plateaued. They weren't rising fast enough to keep up with the explosion in costs and interest rates. The golden goose was looking a little sick. One evening in the late fall of 1979, I was at the co-op picking up some hydraulic fluid. Chet was there, talking to the manager. He didn't look like the confident king he had been just a few years earlier. His face was drawn, his eyes were tired, and he was arguing, his voice tight with stress. "What do you mean you can't extend my credit?" Chet demanded. "I've been doing business here for 10 years. I've got 1,000 acres to plant next spring." The manager, a good man named Dave, looked uncomfortable. "I'm sorry, Chet. The board met last night. With the interest rates where they are, we have to tighten up. Your account is already past due. We can't give you any more seed or fertilizer until you get caught up." Chet slammed his hand down on the counter. "This is ridiculous. It's the bank. They're slow-walking my operating loan. It'll come through next week." "I hope it does, Chet." For your sake, I really do, Dave said quietly. Chet saw me standing there, and his face hardened. The old arrogance flared up for a moment. "What are you looking at, Miller?" he snapped. "Nothing, Chet," I said, picking up my jug of oil. "Just paying my bills." I laid 2 $10 bills on the counter, got my change, and walked out. As I drove home in my old Ford, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The air was crisp and cool, a sign that winter was on its way. But I knew a different kind of winter was coming. A long, cold, economic winter that was going to freeze out the farmers who had built their houses on a foundation of debt. Chet and the others had laughed at my old, paid-off gear. They had mistaken my caution for cowardice. They didn't realize I wasn't preparing for the last boom. I was preparing for the next bust, and it was coming faster than any of them could imagine. The winter of 1979 bled into the spring of 1980, and the chill in the air had little to do with the weather. President Carter had announced a grain embargo against the Soviet Union. Just like that, one of our biggest customers was gone. The price of corn at the local elevator fell 30 cents a bushel overnight. It was like the floor had dropped out from under us. For me, it was a blow. For men like Chet Ainsworth, it was a body shot that took their breath away. His entire financial model was built on $3 corn. At $2.50, the math no longer worked. The razor-thin margins he operated on were suddenly a gaping, bleeding wound. That spring was wet and miserable. It rained every other day, turning the fields into a thick, greasy gumbo. The planting window was getting smaller and smaller. Every farmer in the county was on edge, nerves stretched as tight as a fence row wire. I waited, patiently, for a few dry days to string together. My old 40-20, with its narrow tires, could get into the field a day or two sooner than the big, heavy four-wheel drives that would sink to their axles. Chet wasn't waiting. He was trying to outrun the interest clock. I saw him one afternoon, his massive International 1586 wallowing in a field that was far too wet. The tractor, a behemoth that weighed nearly 10 tons, was churning the black soil into a hopeless quagmire, its dual rear wheels spinning uselessly and compacting the life out of the ground. He was pulling a 24-foot field cultivator, trying to get his ground worked for planting, but all he was really doing was making a mess. As I drove by on the gravel road, I saw a puff of white smoke, then another. From the tractor's exhaust stack, the engine note faltered. He was having trouble. The next day, the dealer's service truck was parked in his driveway. I heard later what had happened. In his haste, he'd pushed the tractor too hard in the mud, overheating the transmission and causing a seal in the hydraulic torque amplifier to fail. It was a complex repair that required splitting the tractor in half, right behind the engine. The bill, I heard whispered at the coffee shop, was over $4,000, plus 3 days of downtime, right in the heart of planting season, while his state-of-the-art machine sat in his workshop like a patient in an operating room. I was out in my fields with the 40-20 and my old 4-row planter, steadily putting seed in the ground. I had a small leak in a hydraulic line on the planter. I fixed it in 15 minutes with 2 crescent wrenches and a new O-ring that cost me 50 cents. The signs of Chet's crisis were no longer subtle. He put his small herd of beef cattle up for sale, the one his father had started. He sold off a 40-acre parcel of timber he'd bought for investment. He was selling his seed corn, the assets he was supposed to pass on to his own son, just to make the interest payments on the land and equipment he'd bought to get big. The confident swagger was gone, replaced by a haunted, hunted look. He stopped coming to the coffee shop. The bank's pickup truck, a shiny new Ford with the bank logo on the door, was seen at his place more and more often. The visits were no longer friendly chats about operating loans. They were meetings about restructuring, about collateral, about due dates. His empire, built on the shifting sands of credit, was beginning to crumble. That summer, the sky turned against us. The rain that had plagued us in the spring vanished completely. A brutal drought set in, the kind that makes the corn leaves curl up in the middle of the day, praying for a drink they won't get. The sun beat down relentlessly from a hazy, white sky. The ponds dried up, and the creeks slowed to a trickle. The corn tasseled early, stunted and weak. My field suffered like everyone else's, but they had a slight edge. The years of using lighter equipment had left my soil structure intact. It held moisture better than Chet's compacted ground. My yields would be down, way down, but I'd have a crop. On his overworked land, the corn was a disaster. Yellow, barren stalks that wouldn't be worth the fuel to harvest them. It was the final nail, a price collapse, a mechanical failure, and a drought. The three horsemen of the farmer's apocalypse had come for Chet Ainsworth. The Federal Reserve was now waging all-out war on inflation. Paul Volcker, the Fed chairman, raised the prime interest rate to levels that seemed impossible. It climbed past 15%, then 18%, finally peaking at a soul-crushing 21.5% in 1981. For a man like Chet, whose entire operation was financed on variable rate loans, it was a death sentence. His payments didn't just go up, they exploded. He was paying more in interest every month than my entire farm was worth. At the same time, the asset that was supposed to be his safety net collapsed. Land values, which had been his collateral and his source of ever-increasing net worth, plummeted. Ground that had sold for $3,000 an acre in 1979 was now struggling to fetch $1,500. Suddenly, Chet owed the bank far more than his farm was worth. He was upside down, trapped, with no way out. The letters from the bank changed from polite reminders to harsh demands, and finally, to the one that every farmer dreads, the notice of foreclosure. The auction was set for a cold, blustery Saturday in November of 1982. The sky was the color of lead, spitting a miserable, sleeting rain. It felt like the world was weeping for what was happening. I drove my old Ford truck down the same gravel road I had 8 years earlier to the Miller auction. This time, the destination was Chet's place. His grand ranch house, the symbol of his success, now had a stark, wooden sign hammered into the front lawn, the black letters spelling out "Public Auction." The mood was nothing like that day in '74. There was no optimistic buzz, no feeding frenzy. The crowd was smaller, quieter. The faces were grim. The men stood in small groups, hands shoved deep in their pockets, their seed corn hats pulled down low. They weren't vultures circling a kill. They were fellow soldiers surveying a battlefield, knowing that any one of them could be next. The farm crisis was in full swing now, and foreclosures were becoming a weekly event across the heartland. I saw Chet standing by the machine shed, a ghost of the man he once was. He was thin, his face etched with lines of worry that hadn't been there a year ago. He wore a simple work coat, the same one he'd probably had for 20 years, not the fancy insulated jackets he'd favored during the good times. He was talking to the banker, a man in a suit and tie who looked deeply uncomfortable. Chet wasn't arguing. He was just nodding, his gaze fixed on some distant point over the banker's shoulder. His fight was over. The auctioneer started, his voice lacking the usual enthusiastic cadence. He sounded more like a funeral director. They sold off the household goods first, then the tools from the workshop. I watched as men I knew, Chet's own neighbors, bought his socket sets, his welding tanks, his floor jack. They weren't getting deals. They were paying fair prices, a quiet act of solidarity to put a few more dollars into Chet's pocket. Then came the iron. The big Gleaner M2 combine, its paint still shiny, sold for less than half of what Chet had paid for it. The 12-row planter went for a third of its value. The market was flooded with used equipment from other farm failures. The machinery that was supposed to be his greatest asset had depreciated into an anchor, dragging him down. Finally, they brought out the International, 1586. It was his pride and joy, the symbol of his entire philosophy. The auctioneer started the bidding at 30,000. Silence. 25. Silence. The only sound was the wind whistling around the corner of the barn. 20,000. A scrap dealer from out of state finally raised a hand. The bidding crept up slowly, painfully, finally stalling at 22,500. Sold. To a man who would likely part it out or ship it overseas. The mighty tractor that was meant to conquer 1,000 acres was worth less than the down payment Chet had made on it. I didn't bid on any of the big items. I had no need for them. But near the end, they brought out an old, beat-up gravity wagon. It was a simple piece of equipment, one Chet had probably inherited from his father and kept around for odd jobs. The paint was faded, and one of the tires was flat, but the frame was straight and the running gear looked solid. "All right, what am I bid for this old wagon?" the auctioneer called out. "Let's start it at $200. I raised my hand. A few other bids took it up to 300. I bid 350. The other bidder shook his head and dropped out. Sold to Earl Miller for $350. I walked over to the clerk's table and paid my money in cash, just like I always did. As I pocketed the receipt, I saw Chet walking away from the crowd toward the old farmhouse his father had built, the one that would belong to the bank in an hour. His shoulders were slumped in defeat. The vindication I thought I might feel wasn't there. There was no triumph, no satisfaction in seeing him brought low. There was only a profound sadness. He wasn't my enemy. He was my neighbor. He'd made a mistake, a big one, but he'd made it with the encouragement of the entire system, the government, the banks, the universities. He'd been told to get big or get out, and he'd listened. I hadn't. That was the only real difference between us. I walked over and caught up to him near the porch steps. He stopped, but didn't look at me. He just stared at the worn wood of the steps his father had probably built. "Chet," I said softly. He finally turned his head, his eyes hollow. "Come to say I told you so, Earl. Go ahead. You've earned the right." "No," I said, shaking my head. "That's not why I'm here." I paused, trying to find the right words. "I saw your boy's 4-H steer over in the small barn. Good-looking animal. He's going to need a way to get it to the county fair next summer." Chet looked confused. "What's it to you?" "I just bought your dad's old gravity wagon," I said, "but I'm not going to have a chance to get the tire fixed on it for a while. I was wondering if you'd be willing to store it for me. Keep it in your barn. Use it when you need to. For as long as you need to." He stared at me, his eyes welling up. He understood what I was doing. I wasn't just giving him a wagon. I was giving him a piece of his own history back, a tool that connected him to his father, a way to keep a promise to his son. It was a small gesture, but it was all I could think to do. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He just nodded, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. In the years that followed, the landscape of our community changed. The farm crisis scoured the county, taking down good men and bad, the reckless and the cautious alike. But the ones who survived were, by and large, the ones like me, the ones who had kept their debt low and their overhead down, the ones who knew how to fix their own machinery and make do with what they had. My reputation in the county underwent a quiet transformation. I was no longer the stubborn old fool. I was the man who had seen it coming. Younger farmers, the ones who were trying to hang on, started stopping by my machine shed. They didn't come to talk about futures markets. They came to ask how to rebuild a carburetor or how to set the timing on an old Farmall M. I'd wipe the grease off my hands, pour them a cup of coffee from my thermos, and show them. I lent out my tools, sold them spare parts at my cost, and gave them my time because I knew their survival was my survival. A community is only as strong as its weakest link. Chet and his family moved into a small rental house in town. He took a job driving a truck for the co-op. It was hard, humbling work, but he did it without complaint. He was providing for his family. About 5 years after the auction, the original 80 acres that Chet's grandfather had homesteaded, the piece with the old farmhouse and the barn, came up for sale again. The investment company that had bought it from the bank had gone bust themselves. I went to the bank and, for the first time in my life, I took out a loan. A small one. I bought that 80 acres. The next day, I drove into town and found Chet. I offered to rent the 80 acres back to him. Not a cash rent, which I knew he couldn't afford, but a crop share lease. He would provide the labor, I would provide the land and the seed. We would split the crop, 50-50. It was an old-fashioned arrangement, the kind our grandfathers had used. It was a partnership. Tears streamed down his face. "Why, Earl?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "After everything. After how I treated you." "Because that land is your family's," I said. "A man needs a piece of ground to call his own. It's where you belong." He started farming that 80 acres with a borrowed tractor and my old 4-row planter. He worked harder than I'd ever seen him work. He was a good farmer, a smart farmer, once you stripped away the ego and the ambition that had been his undoing. Within a decade, he'd saved up enough to buy the 80 acres back from me, paying me exactly what I'd paid for it, with no interest. The day we signed the papers, he shook my hand, and in his eyes, I saw not a defeated rival, but a friend. I'm an old man now. The 4020 still sits in the shed, though my son does most of the heavy work these days with a slightly newer, but still paid-for, tractor. My grandson, a boy of 16 with my same calloused hands, is out there with me now. We're working on the old John Deere 45 combine, getting it ready for harvest. It's more of a hobby machine now, used for a few acres of oats. But I keep it running. It's a reminder. "Grandpa," my grandson says, wiping grease from his forehead with the back of his hand. "Why do we keep this old thing? We could get a much better combine." I stop turning the wrench and look at him. I point to the faded green paint, the simple belts and chains, the open operator's station. "I keep it for the same reason I keep this farm free and clear," I tell him, my voice a little raspy with age. Back in the 70s, everyone was buying new iron. Big, shiny machines they couldn't afford. They laughed at this old thing. They laughed at me. I put my hand on his shoulder and look him square in the eye. But this combine, it taught me the most important lesson there is. It's not about how many acres you farm or how new your equipment is. It's about what you own and what owns you. We own this iron, son. It doesn't own us. And that freedom, that's the most valuable thing we'll ever grow on this land. He nods, a look of understanding dawning on his young face. He picks up his wrench and goes back to work, the clink of his steel on a worn bolt the sweetest sound in the world. It's the sound of a lesson learned, a legacy passed on, a future secured not by debt but by discipline, and the quiet wisdom of the land itself.